Welcome to A Fifth of Mystery. I'm Dan, and in this interview, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Paul H. Smith and talk about his background and experience in the government's remote viewing program. That's right, he was paid by the government to do remote viewing back in the early 80s. And during the course of this interview, we talk about what led up to his involvement in this program, his time that he spent in it as well, but also any implications for the UFO disclosure effort that's going on currently. But he's also just a regular down-to-earth kind of guy, so I think that contrast makes this interview even more interesting.
I said, what do you offer?
So what was the answer?
A new world if you can take it.
Who am I to say that planet Earth is the only location of a life form that is civilized and organized like ours?
Hey guys, I'm here at Contact in the Desert, and I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Paul H. Smith. Dr. Paul, I'm going to call you Paul from here on out.
Oh, please do.
He is in the world of remote viewing, and I've come across him through some podcasts. But I didn't necessarily want to interview you because of your involvement in remote viewing. Mm-hmm. What I really liked about hearing your podcast was how relatable you are as a person.
Oh, okay. So we can talk about anything.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
But the reason that I like that is because I'm a mechanical engineer by education and training. I'm very nuts and bolts. So the remote viewing world seems very far out there, in my opinion. So when I heard you start talking about it, you introduced yourself and your background, and it's just a very regular guy that is experiencing or that was trained to do something that's exceptional. So if you could kind of elaborate on your past and just what did you do before you were in the Army?
Before I was in the Army. Well, I grew up in southern Nevada, but I spent all my summers doing farm work in the Rocky Mountains, then Wyoming, Idaho, Washington State, places like that. That's kind of how I put myself through college, was milking cows and hauling hay and all that kind of thing.
May I ask what you were in college for?
Because there's nothing better to do? No, that's not what you meant. Yeah, I actually started out majoring in art. And that story changes in a little bit here. But yeah, so when I was 21, I went on a mission for the LDS Church, or the Mormon Church, and went to Switzerland, which was awesome. I loved the place. And I came back, got married, and what do I do now? I can't support a family with an art degree. So my then wife, I'm going to say twisted my arm. She started to go down and check out the possibilities with the Army. And I had wanted to learn Arabic, and the Army offered to pay me to teach me Arabic. And I wasn't getting it at Brigham Young University. They only taught Hebrew at the time. So with a great deal of trepidation, I joined the Army, and it turned out to be one of the best choices I ever made. I did learn Arabic, and then they sent me off to Fort Campbell, and we didn't really have a good mission at the time because the Middle East wasn't near as high on the radar as it is today. And so I spent most of my time washing Jeeps and doing and changing the oil in these old clunky Gamma Goat vehicles. I said, there's got to be more to life than this. And so I went off to officer candidate school and became an intelligence officer. And everything was kind of a normal Army career at that point until I get sent to Fort Meade, Maryland. And one day, my next door neighbor and across the street neighbor knock on my door. And they say, Paul, we think you might be good at what we do. I said, what do you do? And they said, well, we can't tell you. I said, how do I know whether there's something I can do or not? And they gave me some tests and stuff. And I apparently scored where they wanted, and they read me on. And my across the street neighbor, so they're living in military quarters. They're both captains in the Army. And Captain Tom McNair, who just wore jeans and a button-down shirt and had a full beard at the time, not typical for an Army officer, as you can imagine. said, our mission here is to collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychology discipline called remote viewing. We're wanting to know if you're willing to volunteer to become a psychic spy. And that was what happened.
So did you have any knowledge or background or awareness of what psychic spies were before
I
that?
had never put the two words remote and viewing together in my life. Now, I had some interest in ESP. As I was growing up, I read a lot of science fiction stories. Andre Norton, Zena Henderson, folks, writers who wrote about ESP in a science fiction context. And I thought this was really cool. But I've been involved in a junior high science fair project that explored ESP and totally failed. I failed, and so did everybody else in the experiment. So I had become a bit of a skeptic. But here's Tom reading me on this really draconian read on the NDA, we call it in the civilian world, right? A non-disclosure agreement. Worse than anything for top secret special department intelligence, which I was read on to already. And I'm thinking, as he's telling me what the mission was, that this is something I was always interested in. I'd come to believe it wasn't true. He's telling me there was a line item in the federal budget to pay to teach people how to do this. There's no way I'm not going to do it.
Let me touch on the one point you said you didn't believe it was true up until that point. What was it that you, why were you at that state?
Well, it's because of that science fair, largely because of the science fair project that had failed, right? I had great hopes that we were going to have psychic experiences, and then nobody had anything. And so I'm thinking, it's fun to read about this stuff, but I haven't seen evidence for this. And at that time, of course, the skeptical world was very skeptical, saying, no, this ESP research and stuff is just a red herring. It's a waste of time.
And exactly what you just described is exactly where I am at
Okay.
right now, because it is difficult for me as a nuts and bolts kind of guy to shift gears into the consciousness.
You engineers, you're all alike.
It's almost like we're manufactured.
Yeah. So, and that was a problem. I hadn't seen any evidence for it, and I'd seen a fair amount of evidence against it, or some evidence against it anyway, right? So but here they're telling me that they're doing it, and the government is paying for it, and that's pretty good evidence, at least prima facie evidence, that there's something to it. And of course, then later on, I proved it to myself that it really did work because I had some success. Now, obviously, it didn't always work, and that's what I tell people. This isn't like something you see in Hollywood where everything's successful, they solve the crimes or whatever like that. This is a little understood human faculty that there is a lot of evidence to show that it does work, and yet it isn't consistent. It sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work. And the reason for that is because we don't understand the causal connections and how it relates to the physical world. And, our modern science is keyed to what's called physicalism, which is and the physicalists will go nuts when I say this, but it is a metaphysical belief. Physicalism is a metaphysical belief about the nature of the world, and it's based on assumptions that everything in the world is physical or a consequence of physical fact, and nothing exists that doesn't fit in those categories. ESP, if you can show that it works, is really good evidence that physicalism is a false premise, that there is a counter examples to that generalization. But because we don't know how it fits in the physical world, we don't always know how to optimize it to make it work all the time. And so that's the problem, why the evidence isn't always consistent.
So I also research ancient human civilizations and history, and I've just about convinced myself that there were certain faculties that our forefathers or ancestors had that we've lost over time with the development of technology and specialization, and that our ancient ancestors were more in tune with the earth, their surroundings, the spiritual world, the metaphysical types aspects of it. So let me ask you this: do you think that the remote viewing that you're discovering is you're actually rediscovering something that was more common in previous generations?
I don't know how much more common it was than it is today. In fact, we don't know how common it is today. I mean, you hear lots of stories. I get phone calls and emails and stuff all the time from people saying, "Well, you'll never believe what happened to me." Well, I think they're really disappointed when I tell them, "Oh yeah, I certainly believe it. Yours are the 15th story I've heard today like this." And people are surprised because they don't talk to other people about this, and they think that this is something that only happens to them or very few people, and they're afraid that if they start telling their friends, that people will laugh at them. And sometimes people do laugh at them. But there are a lot of other people who say, "Wow, you know what? Something just like that happened to me." But they don't talk to those people because they're afraid to open up, right? It's a quite common occurrence, really, and people call it supernatural or paranormal. No, it's not supernatural. It's perfectly natural, and it is not paranormal. It's perfectly normal. It's just that society, because we've been indoctrinated with a physicalist model of the universe, we don't accept or necessarily believe it as a society. So that didn't answer your question. I think that it was probably more widely accepted in the past, and that's where the difference is. But it was also less perfect in the past. Perfect isn't really the right word here, but we've come to understand, thanks to what science has been done in parapsychology, we understand much better the conditions under which it works and how to make it more accurate, even though we're not totally there. In the old days, it was all embedded in this cultural milieu of beliefs, other kinds of metaphysical beliefs, not physical metaphysical beliefs, but embedded in cultural milieu of all kinds of beliefs and things, that some of which it helped you enhance the process, some of which actually got in the way. We still see that today to some degree because there are a lot of different viewpoints on how, for example, remote viewing works. And some of them are maybe accurate, these beliefs, and some of them may just cause more trouble, make it harder to be successful with this. And the beauty of the research that was done is it helped to tease out the signal, shall we say, from the noise, and then improve the prospects of actually using it in constructive ways.
So I guess I should have asked you this earlier. Could you, in general terms, describe what remote viewing is? And then after that, could you describe what remote viewing isn't, where it doesn't go?
Yeah, okay, good. So first and most generally, remote viewing is an ability, it's a skill that capitalizes on an underlying ability that everybody has. We all have this ability to be psychic, for want of a better term. I really don't like the term psychic because there's so much baggage that comes along with it. But we don't really have a better term. There's this underlying extrasensory perception ability that everybody's got. And that was pretty much demonstrated by the early research in remote viewing at SRI International and support of the military's interest in this. Several of the original papers that were published noted that the researchers never found anybody who couldn't do it at least a little bit. So it seems like everybody's got it. But just like any other skill, we're all born with the ability to read, but we don't have the skill of reading yet. We have to be taught that. And if you learn the procedures and processes and what optimizes the behaviors, you then learn the skill, and that allows you to apply it or employ it in a better way. Now, I have again lost the bubble on your question. Remind me what we're supposed to be doing.
What exactly is it, I guess, achieved by remote viewing?
Right. I'm telling you what remote viewing is. Okay, so it's a skill. So when people say, well, when you teach somebody remote view, what is it you actually teach them? I say, well, that's actually simple to explain. There's three things I teach them. How to recognize the signal, which is this very subtle mental input that you could not even notice if you didn't know what to look for. Okay, so how to recognize a signal, how to recognize the mental noise that's always getting in the way of the signal, because we always have this racket going on in our heads, guessing and thinking and speculating and daydreaming and wandering around in our heads. And that tends to obscure this really subtle signal that's coming in. So you have to recognize the signal, you have to recognize the noise. And the third thing is know how to sort them out. Okay. And those are the three basic things I teach people when I teach them remote viewing. But of course, as they say, the devil's in the details. And so it's easy to say that's what you learn, but it's a whole lot harder and more time intensive to teach you actually how to do those things.
So what are some of the misconceptions about what remote viewing is?
Well, when I have this introductory lecture I give to remote viewing, and I say what remote viewing isn't. The first thing is it's not channeling. Now, there's a lot of people channeling, for maybe people listening in who don't know what that is. That's a channeler is someone who gains perceptions or impressions or information from some discarnate entity, some non-physical entity out there that presumably has access to information, experiences, whatever. Then the channeler then can pass on to people, that they're talking to or whatever. Remote viewing is not channeling. It does not require that you have any kind of a spirit guide or be talking to a dead person or any of that stuff. It's something that relies strictly on the faculties of the individual themselves. I call it the most democratic of all these psychic skills, because anybody can do it, and it all depends on your own innate abilities. You don't have to have any kind of intermediary or anything. So it's not channeling. It's not out-of-body experience, OBE, or astral projection. It might be related. Maybe they're on opposite ends of a spectrum. But the experience of remote viewing is significantly different than the experience of out-of-body experience. Whereas in out-of-body experience, you have this impression that you are going whatever going means, going somewhere. You don't usually have control over where you go. You just go somewhere, right? And then you have the experiences there. With remote viewing, you actually do go where you're supposed to go, and do collect information that is needed to be collected, assuming you're well-trained and you have practice and experience. And so while they may be related, they're definitely not the same thing. And the third thing is it's not video in the head, right? I joke about this, but video in the head, by that I'm thinking of the Hollywood version of being psychic, where the psychic, it goes into a trance and they see the murder scene and they see the killer get into a car and they get the car in the car and they read the license plate and they tell the police how to catch this guy, and it's all neatly tied up. And of course, in Hollywood, you have to do it that way because it's not interesting to watch the way a real remote viewer works. That's almost like watching paint dry sometimes. but it unfolds. It unfolds. People think that it unfolds like a video that's unfolding in your head, and it's not at all like that. Remote viewing itself, the experience, and most other psychic behaviors starts off like bits and pieces and gradually knits itself together into a more complete concept of what it is you're trying to perceive.
And it sounds like it takes a duration of time. Is it a session that remote viewing's done in, or multiple sessions?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on how complex the problem is you're trying to solve, right? But the minimal duration we call a remote viewing session. And in a more operational sense, when you're trying to solve a problem like we did in the intelligence world, it can take a while. Now, obviously, impressions can just pop in, and that happens all the time. We have, I call it wild ESP, where you out in the world, all of a sudden you get this flash of intuition, and it brings you to take an action that prevents harm or something, or it helps you take advantage of some kind of opportunity or whatever. And so the input can be very quick, but if you're trying to manage it and be precise and get the sufficient spectrum of information that you're looking for, that can take a while.
So I'm familiar with some historical figures that I'm going to ask you about.
Okay. Genghis Khan? No.
Maybe he knew something we didn't, but there's some figures that I think most of us are familiar with, and the way that they operated, the things that they did, almost make me wonder if they were using remote viewing.
Oh,
and,
okay.
and I'm thinking along the lines of Nostradamus as well as Edgar Casey, the sleeping prophet. Have you ever looked into Edgar Casey in particular? He's the one that strikes me as the most related.
I don't spend a lot of time with Edgar Casey, and that's mostly because I have so many other balls in the air. They called him the sleeping prophet. He would in a sleep sort of state would then diagnose people's illnesses, but he'd also, kind of do prophecies and things like that and such. And it could have been a form of remote viewing. Or Dream ESP. That's something one of the more prominent but less heralded people in the remote viewing history, a guy named Dale Graff. And his focus these days is on Dream ESP, and he's had some really interesting successes with that. And that may be more what Edgar Casey was doing. But then the question arises, well, is that just a form of remote viewing? And all of this stuff is related. As long as it's something that you can verify, you're actually getting legitimate information through. I believe there's been some studies of Casey where they did show that some of his reports were really accurate. Of course, there's other stuff that hasn't been verified or been shown not to be accurate. That's kind of typical of psychic behavior, particularly untrained, more naturally learned psychic behavior, because oftentimes the idea of mental noise isn't understood. And so you'll get a psychic who one day is really accurate and another day is totally wrong. And they often don't know why. And it's because this mental noise thing is a messes things up sometimes. But so, and then, I'm sorry, Edgar Casey, and the other one was Nostradamus. So I have more uncertainty about Nostradamus because his predictions were so imprecise. They were posed in verse. That's interesting. Prose in verse. No, they were posed in verse. So you had to kind of interpret what it was he was saying, and it was always interpreted retroactively. So today we look back on what Nostradamus said, and you say, "Oh, that matches this," or "Oh, that matches that happened." So he was absolutely accurate, or maybe your interpretation is just biased by the future in relation to the past. In a way, it's kind of like a verbal Rorschach test, where you can see whatever you want in what he said. At least that's my impression of him. I've not been persuaded that he has actually been that accurate, and certainly it wasn't actionable. Even if he was accurate or correct about what he predicted about the future, it wasn't anything that you could do anything about at the time he was saying this. And so at that point, I wonder, even if he was correct, what good was he?
Yeah.
So,
what's the point?
Yeah.
Well, getting back to your experience, when you got this proposal to join was it called the remote viewing program?
Yeah, at the time it was called Center Lane, was the code name for it. But yes, a remote viewing program. Now we refer to it as Stargate. And let me say this, people want to write it Stargate as one word. No, that's the TV show. Okay, the actual code name for Stargate was two words, Stargate, separated. But you still see people confused by that, and that adds confusion because then it becomes ambiguous. So you're talking about, the Samantha Carter version, or are you talking about the military version, right? So, yeah, but okay. Now again, I've missed your question.
I didn't get to it yet. That's
okay. Sorry. Yeah.
When you got approached to join the program, were you reluctant? Were you looking at it like, is something I can do, or this is something that's not going to work for me?
So I wasn't reluctant. I kind of told you a little bit. I was gonna, if they were going to give me the opportunity, I was going to take it. And in fact, my then wife notoriously would really get annoyed at me if I made decisions without consulting her, particularly ones affecting my career or whatever. And normally I did. I believe in that your spouse ought to have full awareness of what's going on and whatever, and input into what decisions end up. But this was not negotiable. This was something that I knew was right. I knew, in fact, I felt like unwittingly I had been groomed for this position pretty much my whole life. And so when that was offered, I knew that's where my life should go.
What was the grooming that you thought you were?
Oh, I mean, the interest in ESP, and a lot of ancillary things, like getting in the military in the first place. I mean, that was, I mentioned a little bit about how that happened, but that was really a fluke because I'd started off really interested in the Army when I was little, in both the Army and the Navy. By the time I hit junior high, I did not at all want to have anything to do with the military. When I got back from my mission and got married, my wife was pressuring me into going down the recruiters. I was really resistant to that. And I didn't want to do it. And then I ended up in it anyway. It's almost like kicking and screaming, I got dragged into the Army. And through a whole set of interesting little synchronicities, I ended up at Fort Meade right next door to the operations and training officer of the remote viewing program, not even knowing what remote viewing was. And yet, in fact, when Tom said, you don't have to tell me right away, you have 24 hours, you can tell your wife these things, give me your answer tomorrow. I said, no, I don't need that. Yes, I want to do it right now. He was actually surprised because nobody had reacted that quickly to the invitation before. It's just everything had fallen into place for me. And I, at that point, knew that I was going to do that come hell or high water, literally. So
you jumped in with both feet,
absolutely.
It sounds like.
Yeah.
How was the progression in your accuracy, your capabilities over the course of time?
Yeah, so that was kind of the second part of your question was I worried, or I can't remember how you said, was I scared of something or worried about
Reluctant to
it?
do
Reluctant, that was it, yeah. And I was not reluctant to get in the program. I was unsure whether I'd perform or not because I'd never done it before. And in fact, my first experience, I successfully remote viewed a location, but I didn't remote view the one they wanted me to remote view. And I don't know if we have time for that story, but let me say this about that. At that point, I thought, oh, they're going to fire me because I failed the first time out of the box, right? And that didn't discourage them. I think actually I did so well remote viewing the wrong thing that they figured I had the ability. I just needed some serious training.
Calibrate your scope.
Yes,
basically.
exactly. Yeah. So.
So was it
Yeah.
a fairly quick from not doing it at all to being proficient in quotes?
Proficient took almost, I'd say, we'll say roughly 2 years. But that was partly the way the training process was set up. We would, it started in, so I joined the program the 1st of September of 1983. And like a week or two later is when I had my first remote viewing experience. And then we did it a couple more times, but they were really waiting for the official training contract to be signed. And I and two of my colleagues at Fort Meade, and then one other guy who was put on as a last minute kind of thing, Ed Dames, if you're familiar with his name. Was okay, well, anyway. So there were 3 of us in the unit that had been recruited to be trained. It was myself, Bill Ray, who ended up being our commander at some point, is still a really good friend, and Charlene Schufelt, who ended up marrying a general. So we were good. We were scheduled to go train out in California for the first 2 weeks in January. And then Ed Dames got added as a additional person. And we went out to Menlo Park to SRI International and did 2 weeks of training, then came home for 2 weeks. And then SRI had a closer facility up in New York in Midtown Manhattan, and then we would go up there for 2 weeks. So 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off throughout the coming year. And then we had additional training after that. We started actually, our first operational session, work that we did was, an American DEA agent had been kidnapped by a cartel in I think El Paso, taken across the border into Mexico and ultimately killed. They were desperate to find him, and so even though we weren't fully trained, they ran us on this project. Did I say his name? Enrique Camarena was his name. And so we actually had some success. It wasn't enough to save him because he was actually dead before they even had us tasked. But I don't know how well the others did. I didn't see their work. But my particular session, I did 1 or 2 sessions on it, actually accurately described the setting in which he was found. You know, so, but it took us a while before we were regularly used. I would say probably the beginning of 1986, we started being regularly used in operational real-world remote viewing projects.
So at what point, I'm assuming from 83 to 86, there was a moment that occurred for you that convinced you that this is something that's legit? Like, what was that moment?
Excuse me, that it really worked. My first session was actually persuasive because the wrong target that I described. Oh, all right, I'll tell you the story real quick. I don't know how much time we have left, but so the intended target was a big blue water tower. I mean, huge, big mushroom-shaped thing with all these pipes coming down. And so the way we worked those was we had an outbound team, or beacon team. 2 people went out to the water tower, and it was randomly selected. Nobody knew what it was until they had left the building and opened their instructions. And so they go there, and of course I'm in this hermetically sealed room with a monitor. Skip Atwater was actually the monitor. Neither one of us had any idea where they were going. Okay, so they go to this place and they walk around it and they hug the pipes and they look at it and they take pictures and all that stuff. And then in the protocol, they're supposed to come back and get us and then take me out to the target to give my feedback. So on the way back, they stopped at a donut shop, bought some donuts, and came and gave us the donuts. And we were eating the donuts and went out the water tower. Totally missed and get anything water tower related. And I'm thinking, oh crud, they're going to fire me. They're going to fire me. And I just got started. As we were driving back, I said, "What's that over there?" And Skip turns to me because he knew exactly what had happened. He said, "If you don't get the intended target, it doesn't matter what you get instead." We went over there, it was the donut shop. I had quite accurately described the donut shop, this furniture, the counter with the donuts behind it, but I didn't identify them as donuts. And I didn't even think about that, even though we were eating those donuts. It just never occurred to me. We're coming back, and just something caught my attention. And this happens a lot. And it happened in another case where I had a Hollywood director that had done a movie on remote viewing, and I made him be the remote viewer just so he could experience what it was like. And he was busy talking, whatever, and he just out of the corner of his eye, as we're on the way to target, he sees a target off in the distance. He said, "That's the target." So anyway, that's the experience I had, except it was the wrong thing. But see, they had screwed up because they weren't supposed to stop anywhere. They're supposed to come straight back. So anyway, that's a kind of jumbled retelling of that story. But.
Well, to move us a little bit further forward in time, my understanding is that you did work with Hal Puthoff.
Well, that was, yes, that was actually at the time. Puthoff was involved in our training. Okay, now this is SRI International. The man who had originally created remote viewing, the one who'd given it its name and come up with the original protocols, his name was Ingo Swann, and he was working as a contractor for SRI International. Well, a lot of people haven't heard of it, but this is a massive think tank, research entity that used to belong to Stanford University out in Menlo Park, California, and now does a lot, back then even, hundreds of millions of dollars of research in support of the government, mostly nuclear weapons research, communications and stuff, research and all that, but had this small little remote viewing program that they researched. So anyway, Puthoff was the director of that. He and Russell Targ, who's here at the conference as well, were in charge of it. And so, but I worked with Hal and Ingo, I and my colleagues. Ingo was our main trainer, but Hal had input and did some stuff with us, training stuff. And so that's where I first encountered him. But since I retired and he moved on from SRI, we have been interacted for made my, lots and lots over the time. I lived in Austin for a while. For about 17 years, I had my company there, and I would take my students over to Hal's lab to get a lecture on the early days of remote viewing and the science behind it, and that was awesome. So, yeah.
So Hal Puthoff has his fingerprints over the entire UFO, UAP
Yes.
disclosure effort, which, tying it into the remote viewing world, was a hard connection for me to make, for me to accept. And then something else that got even more difficult was how Puthoff put a paper out about ultra-terrestrials. And basically the gist of that paper was there might be something interacting with us that's at a level that we don't quite understand and can fathom. How does, or is there an ability for remote viewers to interact, engage with anything that would be considered an ultra-terrestrial?
Well, obviously that's the sexiest thing around right now, is thanks to the Nimitz encounter and all of the revelations that have now come out. And I mean, as the actually well-supported evidence builds, it becomes a more and more exciting and interesting thing for people. But I'm going to actually give a talk on the remote viewing UFO interface in this conference. And I explain it this way. It's kind of like trying to explore a mystery. No, trying to explore an enigma using a mystery. Right? But you think about it, the UFO phenomenon, of course now referred to as UAPs, but it is highly resistant to our conventional means of collecting information. The Nimitz thing was interesting because we had so many different channels of data, all mutually supporting each other, and you don't really get better evidence than we got from that event, short of actually having one on public display. Right? So remote viewing is a useful tool when nothing else works, and that's kind of how we treated it in the military as well. We were targeted mostly on projects that normal intelligence collection means had failed to resolve. You weren't getting satellite images, you couldn't get signals intelligence, there was no way of getting spies in there or whatever. And in that respect, it was a whole lot better than nothing. Now, again, like I said, it often didn't work. And the trick was sorting out when it was working and when it wasn't working. But we got fairly good at workarounds so we could understand that. But if nothing else works and you have I'd say about a 30% chance of getting good information using this unconventional channel of collection, then it's worth a try. And in fact, it did prove to be worth a try. We did actually solve intelligence problems using remote viewing alone. That were successful. We were able after the fact to verify that remote viewing actually did solve that problem. But it wasn't, it's about 30% of the time, okay? But that's 30% you wouldn't have been able to address. Well, okay, so why don't we try it with the UFO problem? The questions about ETs, UFOs, mysterious creatures or whatever.
And this came up as part of your experience, or is this after?
This is kind of much after the fact. Now, we did have, I mentioned Ed Dames when he was working with us. He had a fascination with all these anomaly kind of targets. And so he kept sneaking them in on us, and we would work them, and then we get mad afterwards because you couldn't get feedback on them, So what are you doing this, Ed? And now I'm kind of glad because it gives me something to talk about at UFO conferences, right? But that was really, it was not official. In fact, he was told a couple of times, ordered, and ignored the orders. He just tried to sneak them in a different way, ordered to knock it off. So Skip Atwater, I mentioned Skip, he actually worked us on some projects before Ed came around, and he was a lot more rigorous in his approach. He paid attention to the legitimate protocols. And so the data we developed under Skip, I have more faith in than the data we developed under Ed. But nonetheless, it's a reasonable tool to use when you don't have any other tool, right? So that was the short answer to your question.
So has your experience with the remote viewing led you to feel that the UFO phenomenon is validated, that there is something interacting with us?
So up until a few years ago, I called myself kind of a interested agnostic on the UFO question. I didn't rule it out a priori like a lot of the critics and skeptics do, but of course they're in defense of their own worldview, and so they're biased in a certain regard. I wasn't biased either way. I felt like, well, there is certain evidence, but doesn't put it over the top. And it might turn out that it's all smoke and mirrors, and not intentional. Smoke and mirrors means intentional deception. I think that a lot of what was said about UFOs wasn't intended to deceive, but could have been deceptive. Anyway, but some of my remote viewing work on these targets, it partly depended. If I was doing it for Skip, I had more faith in it than if I was doing it for Ed. Some of my remote viewing stuff that's probably what made me a friendly agnostic. Before I was just an agnostic, I was feeling that there seems to be maybe something to this, because I was getting results that when I work against regular targets, I would get verification later on. And I could tell that when I was working a target that there was something true about what I was getting. And then I get verification and I could assess that. And when I had that experience, I was usually right. Okay. And I was getting those kind of feelings about some of this UFO stuff. But of course, I never got verification on it. I still haven't on the specific cases, but the UFO phenomenon in general is getting a lot of verification these days. So it's really more the hard evidence that's pushed me over to being pretty much accepting that the phenomenon is real. And, the details, we're still sorting those out. Is it ultra terrestrials? I'm dubious about that, but of course I've been conditioned to think in terms of extraterrestrial, and so that's where I'm still going with this. But my mind could be changed depending on where the evidence goes, and so yeah. So I think that sort of answered it.
It's pretty close.
Okay.
Something else that is a rumor in the UFO world that I'm hoping to find out in August if it's true or not, is the rumor is that Lou Elizondo, who is a familiar name,
is an alien. No.
Not quite. Maybe it's not. He hasn't denied it,
Yeah.
to the best of my knowledge, but that he used remote viewing in his time in the military as well. And for him to be such a leading voice in the UFO disclosure effort, while at the same time being capable of doing remote viewing, is an interesting connection that makes me think that there's some correlation between the two topics, that they merge at some point.
So in terms of when he was involved, the Stargate program was defunct by then. The CIA was given authority over the program, and the very day it received that authority, it canceled the program. And I've got a whole bunch to say about that, but we don't need to go there right now. So the period where he was doing, involved in the ATIP or whatever, whichever program he is and all that, that would have been after the program was done. So, and to what extent, to what degree, with whom, that kind of thing, until I talk to him personally and get the details, I don't have an opinion, right? I've heard rumors associating the two as well. I'm trying to remember. I think I might even ask Putoff about that, because of course Putoff knows him really well.
That's the connection that goes from remote
is that
viewing
right?
to Al Putoff to
I
Lou
see.
Elizondo to the Stars
Okay,
Academy.
so if that's just an association, then it's purely speculation.
But
Yeah.
Lou, it's rumored that Lou was engaging in remote viewing,
Yeah.
and his book comes out in August. And
We'll see what he says. That's why
one of the
August.
rumors.
Well, we'll see. It could have been just a on the side kind of a thing, and it could have been that he had resources, came through governmental auspices. It could have been Hal put him connecting with, but Hal didn't ever talk to me about that. And from my past experience, he usually consults with me when there's possibility of employing remote viewing in a practical way. And this would be, despite the fact that UFOs is still a practical application of remote viewing. So I'm not going to dismiss it. I'll wait and see what the bottom line is. I don't have any personal knowledge myself about this. It's a logical thing to do, and I hope he was doing it. But I hope he was doing it with people who knew what they were doing. There's a whole lot of people out there who say they're remote viewers, including some of these really prominent people in the remote viewing community who actually don't know their head from hole in the ground when it comes to really doing this kind of thing. In fact, I'm doing a workshop tomorrow on how to remote view anomaly targets responsibly. So, and I don't know when this gets broadcast, if that's even relevant, but
I'm a very slow editor.
Okay. No, I mean in terms of if they're going to even know that you did this during a conference, that might be, you may want to edit all that out. But anyway, there are ways to do it and there's ways not to do it. And I would say, I won't give a percentage, but the majority of people trying to remote view UFOs, aliens or whatever, is done the wrong way. So I'm trying to educate folks. That's why I'm giving that talk tomorrow, or that workshop tomorrow.
So the Pudov thing is I feel like he has been kind of the fuel. He's continued to put fuel in the engine of the remote viewing effort. Do you think that there's any ongoing remote viewing in the military?
Oh no. Military is absolutely not doing remote viewing anymore, at least organically. I mean, every once in a while they may contract with somebody to do some remote viewing, but they don't have their own programs. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Nor do I believe the CIA has a program. I won't go into take too much time going into why I believe that, but I'm very convinced the CIA, and certainly not the military, that they have any remote viewing program at all. The one possibility is National Security Agency, NSA. They may have a program. And I'm going to say do because I don't know as a fact, but yeah.
So my understanding is that the United States got interested in the remote viewing phenomena due to the...
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we got to wrap it up.
I guess we're done.
We're done.
We're being evicted.
Well, thank you very much for your
You are
time.
welcome.
You're a
You're
very
welcome.
pleasant gentleman to hang out with and learn from. So
You're
thank
quite
you very
welcome.
much.
And if you want to do a long distance interview sometime in the future, I'm good for that.
All right. Very much appreciate
All right.
it. Thank
you
you.
betcha.